Hello friends and welcome back to Every Arnold Movie Ever, episode 12. Today I'm covering a story of betrayal, revenge, and bankruptcy. And that's just what goes on behind the scenes. It's Arnold's oft overlooked, I made it to get out of a contractual obligation movie, Raw Deal. By 1986, Arnold Schwarzenegger had notched several modest hits that established a pop culture foothold with Conan the Barbarian, The Terminator, and Commando. His star was on the rise, and his decade of dominance was in its infancy. But he still needed to fulfill a promise to his producer, Dino De Laurentiis. Quick recap, Arnold signed on to make Conan movies for 10 years with Dino, but after Conan the Destroyer failed to significantly improve on Barbarian's box office, they agreed to move on from Conan. Their relationship would become strained, though, after Arnold agreed to a cameo in Red Sonja, but through multiple cameras and tricky editing, that cameo ballooned into one of the leads of the movie. Also, the movie was bad, so Arnold was not happy about that. So Arnold agreed to do one more movie with Dino in order to dissolve their contract. And it just so happened, Dino held the rights to a movie Arnold felt he was perfect for. Total Recall. Dino had been trying to make this movie since 1982, and he had Richard Dreyfuss in mind as the lead. Needless to say, he didn't think Arnold was right for the part, so instead, he gave him a raw deal. He offered him the movie known as Raw Deal, and with Total Recall out of reach, Arnold had to settle for Raw Deal, a movie that existed solely for Dino to make some quick cash to fund his next project, Total Recall. So basically, Dino refused to cast Arnold in the movie Arnold wanted to be cast in, then used Arnold's star power to try and fund the movie he refused to cast Arnold in. Okay, let's talk about the creative team for Raw Deal. Raw Deal was co-written by Norman Wexler, who wrote Saturday Night Fever, Serpico, and was arrested in 1972 for threatening to shoot Richard Nixon. Now, it's believed he suffered from mental illness, and apparently Andy Kaufman's character of Tony Clifton was inspired by Norman Wexler. Now, the other writer was Gary DeVore, who co-wrote Running Scared and also wrote Showdown in Little Tokyo, and not to be outdone by Norman Wexler, died in an insane, unsolved mysteries way that I can barely comprehend. He disappeared in 1996 and wasn't found until a year later in his submerged car, and he was missing his laptop, his hands, and his gun. I'm sorry, what is his hands were missing? The story is wild. I recommend you check it out. I'll actually put a link to this story in the description. It's fucking crazy. And when you hear who wrote this movie, suddenly Raw Deal's looking kind of interesting. What will these two madmen concoct for this film? You'll be disappointed to find out. It's a story about a former FBI agent who was forced out of the bureau due to excessive violence. He's relegated to small-town sheriff duty until a friend in the bureau calls him back in for some undercover work against the mob. Pretty standard stuff, but once you add Arnold to the mix, it's gonna throw a wrench in the entire formula. The director was John Irvin, who directed mostly forgettable war movies. And much like Commando, they surrounded Arnold with some interesting character actors. Darren McGavin, who we all know from A Christmas Story. He plays Harry Shannon, a federal agent with a personal stake in the case. Robert Davi, a famous face from Die Hard, and the Fratelli brother, not played by Joey Pants in The Goonies, plays a mob enforcer suspicious of Arnold's character. They also got this guy from Murphy Brown to play the prosecutor who busted Arnold down to small-time sheriff, and Katherine Harold to play his kind of, sorta love interest. A Raw Deal opens in a shack in the woods where a federal informant is being held. A bunch of old white guys with incredible facial features and bowler hats show up and murder all the feds and the informant, but not before getting in an Arnie-worthy one-liner.
So you want to be a witness? No. Witness this.
The FBI chief is crying over one of the dead agents, and at first you wonder, is he just really emotional, like Deputy Andy Brennan? But there's another reason, which we'll discover in a moment. First, we have to head to some backwoods country, and if you weren't sure we were in backwoods country, here's some country music to help you out. Now here we meet Arnold in a Jeep chasing a cop, and eventually he stops him in the most insane way possible by lighting the road on fire. He hauls the guy in, and we find out that Arnold is Mark Kaminsky, a small-town sheriff, something he wouldn't play again for another 27 years in The Last Stand, and he's nabbed this guy impersonating a cop. He returns to his modest home where his wife Amy is baking a cake while day drinking, totally normal stuff. She complains that they're stuck in the middle of nowhere because he had to leave his job in New York. He explains that he had to resign.
They gave me a chance to resign.
Though I think he meant resign. And he also says Harry a lot.
Harry.
Which he'll do again in Total Recall.
Harry, you're making a big mistake.
And it's one of the all-time great names for Arnold to say, often. It's the word I use the most when practicing my Arnold impression. It's how I learned. Harry!
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 It's Harry from work.
And Harry from work, he was the... Get down!
And I know, right now, as you're watching this, you're trying it yourself. I'd love to hear everybody's Arnold impressions right now. Harry! Now, Amy throws a cake at Mark, and early on, we get his best line.
You should not drink and bake.
And if you're wondering how Mark is going to repair this damaged relationship, honestly, don't worry about it. You will never see her again. Mark heads to Chicago to visit Harry, who's called him for help. And I cannot say Harry without saying it like Arnold. So he goes to visit Harry, and we find out through mangled exposition that Mark was kicked out of the FBI for excessive force against a child murderer.
He molested, murdered, and mutilated her.
Mutilated. And if that weren't enough, they force Arnold to try to say resign again.
Resign or be prosecuted. Any way you want it.
Why are you doing this to the man? Then we find out why Harry was crying earlier. His son was one of the FBI agents killed in that mob hit. And out of nowhere, suddenly, Darren McGavin just puts in work with a real emotional moment.
Dead?
Did no one tell him he was doing raw deal? Even the movie's like, whoa, 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 hang on. That's a bit much for an action movie. We're just going to fade to black real quick, Darren. You can collect yourself, and we're going to pick the scene back up. Just reposition over there by that table, and we'll just come back up and action. Harry asks Arnold to go undercover, but it's unofficial, so he has no cover from the police or FBI. Completely off the books. There's a cute little Dirty Harry reference here.
What do you think I look like? Dirty Harry?
Harry! And then Mark heads off to stage his own death in the most destructive way possible by creating the largest explosion at an oil plant known to man, inadvertently creating a massive issue for the fire department, the environment, and the employment of all those oil workers. The movie doesn't really get into that, though. Instead, we get Arnold heading undercover as Joseph P. Brenner. Basically just Arnold with slick back hair and a cigar. He busts up an underground gambling ring run by the mobster Lemansky to gain favor with that mobster's rival, Luigi Petrovita. But the scene ends up being fun because he throws a guy on the rafters, then drives a truck through the entire building, shades of John Matrix.
Excuse me, could you move to the side a little bit?
This then leads to him going to another casino, but he doesn't bust this one up. He just wants to meet with an underling for Luigi and to basically say, hey, look what I did to your boss's rival. Can I join your crew?
Trying to prove that maybe you can use me?
For what?
To take care of things.
And we meet Luigi's right-hand man, Paolo Rocca, and his top lieutenant, Max Keller. Max is skeptical. Watching Arnold and Robert Davi snipe at each other, it's the only interesting relationship in the movie. Now, while they consider his offer, Arnold does this adorable little run that reminded me of the way he runs in Hercules in New York. But they send some thugs to test him, and Brenner beats them up in an alley. This leads to the cops confronting Brenner and checking his ID. And we get this bizarre line.
Joseph P. Brenner. What's a P stand?
Pussy.
And you know they gave him that middle initial P just for this joke. But why is Pussy as his middle name funny? Why would he even jokingly admit that's his middle name? It only works if he's going to follow it up with something like, what can I say? I am what I eat. See, now we're getting somewhere. And there are a lot of moving parts here. There's the FBI chief, the mobsters, the rival mobsters, now the police. Oh, and Kaminsky also meets a woman in the casino who will start a relationship. Then Luigi gets one of his drug dens raided and loses a lot of drugs and money. He definitely wants that back. Brenner ends up going home with this woman. He pretends to be drunk so he can spy on her. I don't know, their relationship is very strange. I'm assuming it's so he can further assimilate himself with the mob, but it turns out she was also put up to this by Keller, who she used to date. And let's not forget that Brenner is married. Instead of losing the only female character in the movie, aside from his wife who's already disappeared, they decided to go with this weird asexual relationship between Mark and Monique. So, it's only emotional cheating, I guess. Arnold keeps working his way up the ranks to eventually meet Luigi, And they just kind of intersperse some random fights throughout. There's this random mall fight, which has a hilarious climax where Mark throws a guy through the front window and not one person notices or flinches in this busy mall. Then Brenner suggests to Luigi that they call in a bomb threat to the police station to get all the police out of the station so he can get his drugs and money back. It stretches out over several long scenes, and it's not even that important to the plot. It ends up working, and Brenner has finally earned the trust of Luigi. Yay, he's in! But wait! Keller is still unsure of Brenner and does a background check on him by tricking him into taking a picture at a party, then showing that picture to a guy in Miami who would have known the real Brenner.
Never seen him before.
And Keller sets a plan in motion to expose him. They find out that Harry is the one heading up this undercover operation and set out to kill him. And this scene is actually really good because Keller forces Brenner to confront Harry in the cemetery as a way of forcing his hand. And even though we all see it coming, Brenner doesn't and can't help but gasp,
Harry.
He's exposed, it leads to a shootout, and Keller ends up getting killed. That's too bad. Keller was the most interesting villain in this movie. But then it leads to the best, most unintentionally hilarious moment thus far, where Brenner consoles a dying Harry with one small request.
Harry, don't die.
And then when Harry's like, get out of here before you're arrested, Brenner goes,
I see you soon, okay?
and he just runs off as if they've just finished around a racquetball and they're going out for some drinks later. And then we get to a point where pretty much the entire conceit of the movie, the fact that Arnold is asked to go undercover, off the book, so he can infiltrate this mob family, expose their crimes, and seek revenge for his friend's son's death, is completely negated. The way the movie ends, he could have skipped all of those steps because his next move is to throw away all the relationships he's built and just give us another Commando-style gearing up montage and heading to the gravel pit. Now, the gravel pit, they make it sound like we've known about it this whole time, but we only hear about it while Brenner is preparing to go to the gravel pit. We hear some VO from Harry that sounds like a flashback from earlier, but I do not remember this specific dialogue.
Yeah, that's the gravel pit. It's owned by Petrovita. You get an invitation, don't go.
So we'll just assume that that happened when they dipped to black after he was crying. Anyway, Arnold heads to the gravel pit. He busts out the windshield of his car, then pops Satisfaction from the Rolling Stones into the tape player, even though that's not actually what's on the tape. I wonder if he did the thing where he puts a piece of tape on the bottom of the cassette tape and basically turned it into a blank tape. Oh God, I'm old. And we are treated to one of the most absurd Arnold action sequences thus far in his career, recklessly driving a car at a high speed over bumpy terrain, vaguely aiming a semi-automatic weapon at a target 100 yards away, and never missing. It feels like we accidentally sat on the remote and changed a channel to another movie, or as if a producer was like, I've always wanted to do a shootout in the gravel pit. Can we work that in here? There's this funny bit where he slams into a bulldozer, and for some reason, they want us to believe that he's in peril of getting sandwiched, but like, he's got plenty of time. Just get out of the car. But oh, there you go. Great. Then he kills this guy in the dump truck, and we get a hero shot and the perfect opportunity for a one-liner. But for whatever reason, they don't pull the trigger. Come on, do it. Catchphrase me, I'm here. I'm just saying, this scene would be 1,000 times better if it went like this. What the dump. Finally, after all the gravelly, pity goodness, Arnold heads off to kill Luigi and all the other nondescript mobsters. We get a stick around from Luigi.
You! Stick around.
Which Arnold will repurpose in Predator.
Stick around.
Kaminsky tears through these guys like butter, including Sven Ole Thorsen, Arnold's old buddy who's been in Conan and Red Sonja. Kills all Luigi's guys, kills Luigi, and pours drugs on him, which is supposed to be symbolic, but Kaminsky has shown no emotional connection to stopping drugs from hitting the streets, so it doesn't resonate at all. It would have made more sense if, like, he had a daughter who was hooked on drugs, or maybe even his wife who has a drinking problem could have been a drug problem, and now suddenly Arnold has a personal stake in this. I'll talk about that in a second. Let's get to our long-awaited, I guess, showdown between Kaminsky and Baxter, the prosecutor who busted him and sent him to the small town. Kaminsky recognizes the irony of the situation.
This must be what they mean by poetic justice.
And that would work a lot better if we actually saw Baxter and Kaminsky's backstory, or if they shared any scenes up until this point. And Arnold's tongue is tortured one more time when he has to say again,
Resign or be prosecuted.
Baxter chooses to neither resign, or be prosecuted. He opts for a fourth option, eternal darkness. And I can't even imagine the amount of paperwork required for the cops to clean up this entire mess. For the coda, Kaminsky ends his sexless affair. The cop who's been tailing him is like, I knew you were a cop. And he meets up with Harry, who survived, but now can't walk. Mark tells him that he's back with the FBI and his wife, and then screams at Harry until he walks.
You don't have to walk, but you have to try like hell.
And the nurse cries. Not sure if it's because she's witnessing a miracle or elder abuse.
Give me the goddamn chair.
Then walk.
And then the movie ends on a freeze frame between two best friends. Huh, I guess that's what the movie's about. Raw Deal feels like a much earlier Arnold movie, almost like a beta test for Commando. The Arnold formula just doesn't quite click into place. And I think it's because this is tame compared to Commando. It feels a bit like a step back. His character is more robotic, the violence isn't as cheeky and fun, and the personal stakes for his character are much, much lower. Had this come out prior to Commando, I think it would have had a better reputation. It would feel like a more natural progression. But following Commando with Raw Deal is like throwing a grenade on a building after you've dropped a nuclear bomb on it the day before. The gravel pit scene is really the only thing I remember from seeing this as a kid, and it's easily the most entertaining sequence. The final shootout is gratifying, it's just a bit generic, but my biggest issues with Raw Deal are the personal stakes. Unlike the simple through line in Commando of a kidnapped daughter, Kaminsky's motivation lies in thinly sketched domestic trouble and a work problem that happens off-screen. It's confusing and tertiary to the main plot. They expect us to be on Kaminsky's side because a crooked prosecutor punished him for excessive violence as a federal officer. In reality, we're on his side because he's played by Arnold, but that prosecutor's instincts actually turn out to be right because Kaminsky is a mass murderer, even if he's murdering the right people. And his wife is an alcoholic baker because they've been forced to live in a small town. So in order to fix his marriage, rather than like work on it, he tries to get his job back at the FBI, but in order to do that, he has to go undercover in the mob in an off-the-books operation that will get him in even more trouble if he's exposed. But because this is a movie, his reckless murder spree gets him his job and his wife back, and he's able to yell Darren McGavin's paralysis into submission? Okay. I take back what I said about this movie not being as unhinged as it should be. I sound like an insane person explaining this. Now, I don't think Arnold does a terrible job, but he's kind of boxed in here. He tries to make the material work, but it's clear he's not having as much fun as he did on Commando. It's just outside his comfort zone at this time. He's supposed to be playing a suave and smooth guy with slick back hair and suits and cigars, but it comes across as stilted and awkward. He'll revisit that in True Lies to much greater success, so we know he has it in him, but it requires a top-notch storyteller like Cameron to bring it out. On top of that, a lot of his key dialogue comes out muddled or lacking the translation of his real-life charisma. Outside of,
You should not drink and bake.
none of the one-liners really land. He's not leaning into the gleeful cheesiness of Commando and not surrounded by the sophisticated storytelling of the Terminator. It tries to combine a respectable, sprawling, organized crime story with an Arnold Schwarzenegger action picture, but it ends up a lot like Amy's Cake. Now, I found some additional production stills showing Brenner wearing a mustache, Brenner checking on his alcoholic wife who's passed out, and a couple other scenes that are referenced but we never actually see. And it's obvious a lot of changes were made in post-production. Whether it would have made the movie better or not, I don't really know, but I do know mustaches never make things worse. For the marketing, they leaned heavily on Arnold's image and less on the story. They figured they gave Schwarzenegger a raw deal. No one gives Schwarzenegger a raw deal was enough of a selling point. The poster emphasizes that. It's just Arnie in a white tank top and a gun. It's exponentially less interesting than The Terminator or Conan, but comparable to Stallone's Cobra, which came out the same year and has a similar plot. However, Cobra is actually better remembered because it unintentionally out-cornballed Raw Deal with lines like,
"You're a disease, and I'm the cure."
And also, Stallone's character's name in Cobra was Cobretti, so maybe if Arnold's name in Raw Deal was Ronald Delio, we'd still be talking about it today. Reviews were unkind, most of them citing it as a more confusing version of Cobra, and not even Ebert could muster his usual support for Arnold. This plot is so simple, and has been told so many times before, that perhaps the most amazing achievement of Raw Deal is its ability to screw it up. This movie didn't just happen to be a mess, the filmmakers had to work to make it so confusing. Now, although Raw Deal was unfavorably compared to Cobra, when it released in theaters on June 6, 1986, it actually beat out Cobra in its second week, making $5.4 million, though it couldn't top Top Gun, which surged back to number 1 in its fourth week. The next week it dropped to number 5 against new releases of Back to School and Ferris Bueller's Day Off, and by week 3 it was 8th, and that was that. Ultimately, it earned $36.5 million worldwide on an $8 to $10 million budget. That's a success, but far below expectations. A Raw Deal is an important movie for Arnold, but it has nothing to do with the movie itself. It allowed Arnold to finally separate himself from Dino De Laurentiis. It also separated Dino De Laurentiis from a lot of money. Since the movie wasn't a huge financial success, it plunged his company into bankruptcy, and the one way Dino stayed afloat was to sell off the rights to his pet project, and Arnold convinced his producing partners from Red Heat, Mario Kassar, and Andrew Vina, yes, it's Vina. After 30 years of mispronouncing that and giggling like a little middle schooler, I finally looked it up how to properly say it.
Andrew Vina.
And Arnold convinced Kassar and Vajna at Carolco Pictures to purchase the rights to Total Recall as a starring vehicle for Arnold. And that is what they call poetic justice. But that story is for another time. All right, let's get to the stats. Acting chops, 5. He may have gotten a little too confident in his abilities, and the dialogue does him a disservice. Kill count, 25, though it feels like 50, for a total of 240. Catchphrase, you should not drink and bake. And here are the updated every Arnold movie ever rankings. Got your cameos. At the bottom, Forever and Ever, Hercules in New York. Number 9, The Villain. Number 8, Red Sonja. Number 7, Stay Hungry. Number 6, I gotta tell you, I really struggled with this placement. Number 6, Raw Deal. Number 5, Conan the Destroyer. Number 4, Pumping Iron. Number 3, Conan the Barbarian. Number 2, Commando. And number 1, The Terminator. Next up is one of my personal favorite guilty pleasure Arnold movies that sees him step back into the sci-fi genre to dole out delightfully ham-fisted, on-the-nose, punny one-liners while battling an evil Richard Dawson and yelling, "Killian!" a lot in a story based on a Richard Bachman novel. That's right, it's The Running Man. See you guys next time. Made it to get out of a contractual obligation. The movie Raw Deal. I made it to get out of a contractual obligation. Obligation. So close. Why did I write it like this? And both titles were apt descriptions of Dino and Arnold's business relationship at that time. It's Running Man. Fuck, it's The Running Man.